Men take credit for women's work for one reason: because they can. It's just one of the many injustices women endure in their lives simply because they're female. I'll give you another example. When I was a young lawyer, I asked a judge for a 15-minute break during trial so I could breastfeed my newborn baby girl. She wasn't sitting under my chair. She was in a private room being cared for by my mom. The judge said, no, we don't take breaks for that. This was the same judge who 4 weeks earlier granted my opponent a 1-month delay in the trial because my bulging belly might prejudice the jury in my favor. Many years later, I had to give birth to my 5th child on a Sunday night. I induced her birth so I could get to the state Supreme Court Wednesday morning. This was after a different judge denied my request to schedule the hearing prior to my due date. I got out of the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon, trudged to court the next morning, still in my maternity clothes, utterly exhausted, in a bit of pain, and carrying a 2.5-day-old baby. So you're probably thinking, what's with those judges? Why would they do that? Aren't there laws against sex discrimination? There are, and there were back then. But they don't work very well because the United States Constitution does not protect women equally under any laws, including laws against sex discrimination. Most people don't know this about the Constitution because we don't teach it in schools and we don't talk about it very much. To the contrary, we promote the idea of equality for all as if it is a well-settled foundational principle of American democracy. In fact, the words equal justice under law are carved into stone on the outside of the United States Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., even though that very court has repeatedly ruled that those words do not apply to women. You probably already know this, but this problem is not unique to the United States. In 2020, the United Nations released a report in which it said, no country has achieved gender equality. No country. And in their report, they describe many of the ways that women suffer harm because of their inequality, including obvious things like unequal pay, disproportionately high rates of rape, domestic abuse, sex trafficking, and, as I mentioned, discrimination against pregnant women. Lesser-known harms can be harder to see and even harder to measure, like men taking credit for women's work. I just finished writing a book about this phenomenon in which I tell the stories of more than 25 women whose work was credited to men. And I explain in the book why the driving force behind the problem is women's inequality under the law. How could it not be? If you're not entitled to equal treatment under the law, you're easier to steal from because you have a worse chance of winning if you fight back. One of the women I write about is a little-known scientist named Eunice Foote. Eunice was raised in upstate New York in the 1800s in a large farming family. Her parents believed that women and girls deserved an education as much as men and boys, so they sent her to the Troy Female Seminary, which at the time was one of the only colleges in the country that offered women an education that was equal to that which was offered to men. This meant that Eunice could study math and science, as well as conversational French. Eunice loved science. She absolutely loved it. She wanted to be a scientist. But women weren't welcome in the profession. So she built a lab in her home, established herself as an amateur, and started doing experiments. In 1856, she designed an experiment to look at the effect of the sun's heat on different gases in the atmosphere. And what she found was that carbon dioxide traps the sun's heat more and takes longer to dissipate once the sun's heat is removed. In other words, Eunice had discovered the greenhouse effect. She was so excited, she wrote up her findings, and she wanted to present them at the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which was a very prestigious academic conference. But women weren't welcome. So a man presented her paper for her, and good for him, he gave her full credit. Later that same year, 1856, Eunice's paper was published in the AJSA, a highly regarded journal, the American Journal for Science and Arts. It was the first time a woman's paper on physics had been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So it was a big deal. 3 years later, in 1859, a man named John Tyndall, who had published a paper on eye color in the same journal where Eunice's paper had appeared, conducted a scientific study similar to Eunice's. And he came up with similar findings. Only he didn't cite Eunice's paper. He didn't mention Eunice at all. In fact, he declared himself the first person to discover the effect of the sun's heat on carbon dioxide. He became world famous, eventually earned the title, the father of climate change. Buildings and institutes and satellites were named in his honor. Nobody honored Eunice. That's how things went for a long time, until 2010, when a retired geologist happened upon an article about Eunice's paper in an 1857 trad magazine. He was shocked. He wrote an article about his discovery, and he shared it with the scientific community, and the truth started to come out. And it's still coming out today. Tyndall could never have gotten away with taking credit for Eunice's work if Eunice had been an equal person under the law. Convenient for Tyndall. Things didn't get any better for women a few years later in 1868 when we adopted the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, even though it had a provision that gave equal rights to people. The specific language said, persons shall have equal protection of the laws. Now, you'd think that would be good for women because women are persons, right? Wrong. The Supreme Court repeatedly refused to rule that women were persons. That didn't happen until 1971. In 1971, the Supreme Court finally said, in the throes of the Civil Rights era, mind you, okay, fine, women can be persons under the Equal Protection Clause. Great, you're thinking. Women are all set now, right? Wrong again. There was a catch. The court's decision said women's equal protection rights would be unequally enforced in the courts. I know. Equal rights, unequal what? It's a head scratcher, I know. How can a person have unequal equal rights? It makes no sense. But that's exactly what the Supreme Court did in 1971, and it's exactly where women are today under the law. Now, before you go off thinking that the solution is to just put better judges on the Supreme Court, let me tell you why that won't work. The leading case on the status of women under the Equal Protection Clause was issued by the Supreme Court in 1996. And it said, women are not entitled to equal treatment under the Equal Protection Clause. The author of that decision was a justice named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I know. RBG. A few years later, her colleague, Justice Antonin Scalia, explained what that ruling means for women when he said, the Constitution doesn't require unequal treatment or discrimination against women. The only question is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't. And he's right. So what do? Well, obviously, we can't turn to the Supreme Court for help. No matter who we vote for and no matter which judges get on the court. They've made it very clear, all sides of the aisle, they're not going to do the right thing. But what we can do, what we the people can do, is fix the Constitution by amending it. Article 5 lets us do this, and we've done it many times. We need to do it again. The amendment we need is called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. Some of you, I'm sure, have heard of it. It states, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Simple. Who could possibly object? Right? Trust me. Moneyed interests object strenuously to women's equality, which is why the ERA is still not in the Constitution, even though we've been fighting for it for over a century. December 2023 marks the 100th anniversary of the first time the ERA was filed with Congress. We've been fighting for it constantly ever since, but most people don't even know what it is. After all, women look like they're doing okay. We have a woman vice president, right? When I give talks about the ERA, I'm always asked this question. Wendy, I don't get it. What's the problem? What rights do men have that women do not have? My answer is always the same. That's the wrong question. The right question is, are women entitled to equal treatment under any laws? The answer to that question is no, none, zero. From getting a dog license to child custody laws, freedom of speech, and even laws against slavery. No laws must, as a constitutional matter, be applied equally to women. No laws. This leaves women in a constant state of legal insecurity. You might even call it a kind of constitutional terrorism because of the fear and anxiety that comes from knowing that your government, all officials in all branches at all times, state and federal, your government has the right and the constitutionally granted authority to treat you differently and worse simply because you're female. We can pass laws all day long. Equal pay laws, equal this laws, equal, all look like they're really good for women. But so long as they are not enforced equally, so long as the government isn't required by the Constitution to enforce them equally on behalf of women, they're worthless, meaningless. It's like pushing crumbs around on a broken plate. They just fall through the cracks. We have to fix the plate first. We have to get the word out so that people can come together in unity and fight for this basic human right to equal treatment under the law for all, not just some. We have to get the word out, and I don't know how to do that. I don't own a network or a newspaper. Maybe some of you do. If you have any thoughts about how to help get the word out, please let me know. I do have one idea. Remember the words I mentioned earlier that are carved into stone on the outside of the Supreme Court building? Remember what they were? Anybody? Very good, very good. Equal justice under law. I say we start a campaign to get those words covered in black. We should just protest and pester the Supreme Court to put a big black drape across the whole phrase. Of course, they'll never do it. But it doesn't matter, because the campaign to do it will get the word out. People will ask questions. What's wrong with the words? Why do people want to cover them in black? We have to get the word out, because the people in this country, and frankly, people around the world, who think of this country as the greatest democracy on earth, they all have a right and a need to know that for half the population in America, those 4 words, equal justice under law, are a lie. Thank you.